Welcome to episode 4 of On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. Our podcast is dedicated to helping Christians target the right priorities in their apostolic and interior lives.
Well, hello and welcome back to On the Mark. I want to welcome everybody back for this episode. And of course, I want to welcome our guest as always, Mark O'Donnell. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
This episode, we will be discussing something that has been spoken about for thousands of years. Pilate asked what it was a couple thousand years ago. More recently, we heard Jack Nicholson tell Tom Cruise that he couldn't handle it. And of course, in courtrooms throughout the country, people are swearing to tell it every day, and that's the truth. And so we're going to focus on the truth, and we're going to do it in a way where we're going to take an excerpt from a book written by Romano Guardini, and the title of the book is Learning the Virtues That Lead You to God. And for those who have some familiarity with Romano Guardini, very influential philosopher, theologian, late 19th century, early 20th century German, and was very influential in inspiring and helping our three most recent popes craft, part of their theology and doctrine. And so there are a handful of chapters that we'll, over time discuss. I think the next time we'll talk about another chapter on asceticism, but in this time we're going to focus on this chapter on the truth. He starts this chapter by defining the truth in many different ways, but very succinctly as saying, the truth is as a speaker saying what is so, as he sees it and understands it, and that he should express what is in his mind. And then he goes on and saying, in doing this, meaning in telling the truth, there might be a cost to somebody who's willing to tell the truth. And it could be something as little as, an inconvenience, or it could be something much more harmful or perhaps even dangerous. And so I'm wondering, Mark, as you read this chapter and what you know about Guardini, is there any room here, given this definition, for a fib, a slight prevarication, or a white lie?
Well, you'll get different answers from different people, but I would say telling the truth is super important, and it's a great way to evangelize in our current culture, which is more and more accepting of lies in order to get ahead and succeed. I think a lot of that started off with the show Survivor back in the 1990s, where we kind of applauded who could lie the best to stay on the island. And then it kind of injected itself into the political system where politicians started to become successful, even though people knew they were lying. And so then they lied more. But it's not limited to those areas. The nuns used to tell us, tell the truth to shame the devil. Unfortunately, there are not many nuns left. So younger people are not really hearing the message. The long run, honesty is the best policy, no question about it. But that doesn't mean we can never joke around. It just means you have to be careful. If a person does not have a sense of humor or cannot recognize irony, you need to be careful if you're going to tell him an April Fool's joke. He may not get it or appreciate it. He may think you're lying. He may resent you. So know your audience, before you begin fibbing or pulling their leg. Charity, as Guardini says in that chapter, is just as important as truthfulness. But that being said, a world without humor is a very tough place to live.
I'm just wondering, is there any room for or an allowance for, the Anne Frank lie? She's hiding up in the attic and the SS officer comes to the door and you tell them, hey, there's nobody there.
I think there clearly is. We're not morally compelled to tell the truth to people who have no right to know it, especially if they're going to commit a grave crime with the information. How we avoid telling the truth in these situations will depend a lot on the circumstances. We should ask the Holy Spirit for help. But I think one model here is, St. Thomas More. He didn't want to reveal the truth of his conscience to people, and they wanted desperately to find out what he was thinking. And yet he held that because he wanted to be protected by the law. In the end, he ended up being killed. But that's a good example too.
Today we hear a lot this phrase, fake news, and suggesting the news media, with a very, revered and once very trusted, august institution, can no longer be believed. And so I guess, add the news media to a list of other institutions that can't be believed. Guardini, of course, doesn't speak to this fake news claim specifically, but he does emphatically pronounce that our existence and a functioning society depends upon the truth. Is he overstating it, or does our functioning as a society depend on this virtue being lived at all levels, from the interpersonal to the institutional?
Yeah, I think all meaningful relationships are based on truth and trust. I mean, in the white paper, I was writing about these real estate deals that went sideways, and they went bad when my partners began lying to me in significant ways. It reminded me of what Charlie Munger just said. Not just said, but said during his business career, and that was to stay away from toxic people and toxic relationships. Lying is toxic, and when we lie to gain advantage, we become toxic, no matter how we attempt to justify it. So these are people that lie we should avoid working with, or worse yet, becoming.
He really focuses on this notion that it is a hinged virtue of sorts, and that so many things depend upon it. It reminds me, I've been in the finance world for 38 years, and a couple of decades ago, I met a gentleman who was the head floor trader on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, when that meant something. If it wasn't the floor of the exchange, now is more more like a museum than a functioning financial apparatus. But I went down there a couple of times to meet with him. He ended up becoming a client of mine as he was retiring. He was a head floor trader for a firm. And it was pandemonium, as people would recall. And it really looked as though you could make no sense of it. It looked complicated. It looked, really lack of order and, incredible disorder. And you kind of look around and you say, how does a place like this function? And I asked him at one point, you had, guys like him, they get orders from, their sales guys at a brokerage firm to go down to their floor operation, or would take an order to a specialist who represented all kinds of different stocks, trying to maintain an orderly market. And he kind of looked at me one point. He said, yeah, I mean, when you strip it all down, he said, the essence of this is, you cannot function this place if you don't tell the truth. He said, a man's word is his bond, and that's how this place operates. And so in the midst of all that calamity and turmoil and, outward pandemonium, that was the central governing force for that entire operation. Now,
Interesting.
of course,
Yeah.
it's changed a lot because technology has taken over. Of course, it still is, you can still deceive somebody through technology, but that was really quite a telling moment for me, that something as meaningful as that was dependent on something as simple as just telling the truth, and that really is what made it operate fluidly and appropriately. I'm wondering, Guardini, he says, he comments on this a little bit in the chapter, and I think it's a good point. Is it possible to be too truthful, whereas you're telling the truth, you're stating a fact or a reality, but you're just doing it maybe at the wrong time, and maybe, in an unsolicited way. Maybe offer you some thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I think the art of communication, it's a real art. I mean, you hear companies when they talk about their earnings and forecasts and so forth, and they may know potential problems down the road, but if they're confident that they can manage through them or around them, they may not need to go into specific detail regarding them. There's a whole legal practice that governs, what needs to be said and when, but that's a real art. It now seems that disclosure is the road best traveled. That's certainly the case in real estate. First thing I learned was disclose, disclose, disclose. And that's a good practice to get into the habit of doing, without getting carried away. And Guardini mentions that we need to exercise truth with charity, and not just to use it as a club to beat people over the head. But in order to do that, you have to have discernment and good judgment. They're needed. And how do you acquire those? Well, you see other people doing them. You see your parents doing them. You see a good boss doing it, a teacher, a coach. I remember when I was at Allied Signal, I went down to Mexico because we were doing our strategic plan. And this guy we had just hired from McKinsey, he came up to me and he said, "Look, I'm sorry, but all the numbers we gave you for the plan were wrong." And I said, "Oh, do you want to adjust them?" And he said, "No, the previous people just made them up. So just throw them away. I'll get you some numbers in a week, but we got to start from scratch." And it was kind of a brutal thing to do, but that's how you have to do it sometimes. And so he knew, he was new, this was his shot. He didn't have to massage someone else's incorrect numbers. And I kind of admired him for doing that. It helped us a lot.
It seems as though a way to be more consistently truthful with others is to start by being more truthful with ourselves. And I guess why we speak the truth to others, or we want to be truthful with others, in doing that, there's times where we can be deceiving ourselves. And so I'm wondering, what is the balance between being authentic and genuine versus falling into this camp of kind of finding, and I'm saying parenthetically, my truth?
I think it's very difficult to be truthful with ourselves. I know most of us think the opposite, but I would say it's very hard to do that. St. Josemaria Escriva used to say that he considered sincerity the most important virtue. And he often said that we had to be savagely sincere. I mean, this shows just how hard it can be. It takes courage, a lot of courage sometimes. I mean, Guardini mentions that in the chapter. I don't think there's a lot of balance here. I think our truth has to be the truth. There's only one truth. Pope Benedict said in Salt of the Earth when he was cardinal and had that interview with Peter Seewald that that when people are not told the truth, he said they're degraded. That's pretty strong. He said, we often put other criteria ahead of telling the truth, such as the good opinion of others, our own advancement, or just avoiding problems. And he called this unwillingness to confront problems truthfully the worst form of administrative management. It was shortly thereafter that the sex abuse crisis broke and confirmed what he had stated. But so I think it's going to require courage. And we'll talk about that hopefully in a future podcast. And that's to a large extent missing today.
So I'm wondering, what are the deleterious effects of not telling the truth? I mean, Guardini says, and I'm quoting, "Every falsehood destroys the community." While that is true, can't we see the damaging effects even more profoundly in personal relationships, not just on the institutional level, husbands to wives, wives to husbands, parents to children, and so forth?
I mean, definitely. I mean, the effects are broken relationships, whether in the personal or business arena. I mean, those are the effects. When I caught one of my real estate partners lying to me, I told him the overbilling he had done on the invoice to the LLC we were using was not correct. And I said it wasn't truthful. It didn't correspond to reality. And his response was, well, it was truthful for me. It meets my truth. In other words, he didn't care what reality was. He wanted the extra money so badly that he just deluded himself. And when he got caught, he just denied it. And then the other real estate deal where my partner said that he did not have mortgages, or he had mortgages on properties that were not encumbered. When I called him on that and told him, well, I thought you had mortgages on all these properties that I asked you to contribute. And he said, did I say that? He looked at me like he had lost track of what he had said. Both those instances, that was the end of the relationship. I mean, Charlie Munger would have been proud of me for terminating them.
I had a years ago, so this was kind of in the wild, wild west, when in my business we would call people over the phone and try to attract them to do business with us, right? By pitching a stock or a bond or something of that sort. And this friend of mine, we were at a big Wall Street firm at the time, and he called this guy up. And the idea was you would call somebody, introduce yourself, offer to send out some information describing, your firm, a little bit of your research process, and then, you'd call them back in a week or so later. And so we went through this process with this guy. I didn't really recognize or realize that this guy was quite substantial in net worth. And so he called him on this particular company. I remember the name. I won't share it, but I remember the name. And this guy relented to this guy's aggressive pursuit, my buddy's aggressive pursuit. And he said, all right, buy me 5,000 shares. And the stock at the time was at 13 and 5/8. That's when stocks used to trade in increments of eighths. Now they trade in pennies. So he did it. And at the time, so that was a nice order for a guy. At the time, he was very young. He was just new in the business, probably, 23, 24 years old. And the guy called him the next day and he said, I don't want to do it. Cancel it, sell it. And my friend said, try to dissuade him. He said, no, that's it. I want you to sell it. So he put an order in. So the order from the client was to sell it, not to sell it at a particular price. He put an order in to sell the 5,000 shares at 13 and 5/8, which was at a limit. And so the stock traded down, 3/8 to a quarter, maybe he got down to 13 and he still hadn't sold it. A few days had elapsed. And the client called him and said, I never got my confirmation that you sold the stock. And he said, well, I didn't. And he said, well, I told you to sell it. He said, well, I'm waiting to get 13 and 5/8 so you don't lose money. He said, that wasn't my order. So
Wow.
what happened was he was so truthful to this guy. And so he ended up selling it and he took the loss. And so what happened was this guy, the client, became quite agitated and in kind of a profane outburst to let him know that you better sell it now and you're eating the loss, which again, at the time, he was a young guy and it was, it wasn't the end of the world, but it was pretty good money to him. But he
Yeah.
admitted that he did it. And so what happened is over time, he ended up being impressed with the way that he was truthful, conducted himself, didn't try to deceive him. And that ended up this guy was worth many hundreds of millions of dollars, and it ended up becoming a very meaningful relationship, all built on what could have been a disaster, but was really the cornerstone and the bedrock of that relationship was admitting a fault and telling a truth. So that it kind of goes back again to this being a hinged virtue. And,
Oh,
so we
yeah.
just talked about a little bit about the deleterious effects, but there can be, when you do this well, even though it may be uncomfortable and could potentially have damaging effects, it could really, in this case, be the start of a meaningful business relationship.
No, I mean, that reminds me, kind of getting into your next question here about, truth with a capital T. I mean, when I was in the convenience store business, there were two instances that kind of come to mind when you're just telling that story. One was when I bought my first store, the store wasn't doing very well at all, right? I didn't know anything about the convenience store business. And I bought it, Tuesday night in the middle, in Johnston, Rhode Island, paid like $6,200 for it or something like that. Anyway, a lot of the inventory wasn't good. And I figured I got to drive sales. So how do I do that? So the Coke guy came by that week and I talked to him about, buying Coke, lots of Coke and discounting it so I could sell it at the price of the supermarkets and drive traffic. And
Just
he
to be
said, "Are you
clear,
serious?"
Coca-Cola.
Sorry?
Just to be clear, Coca-Cola, not narcotics.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Good point. We need to do that now. We're in 2023. But so they started selling me hundreds of cases, and I was going through this stuff. I put a big sign. I was on Route 6, and all sorts of traffic was going by there every day. 2 liters, 89 cents, which is a great price. I don't know what they go for now, $4 or something. But over time, I just got used to the Coke driver coming and dropping the stuff off, and and I just would sign the bill, and he would leave, and so forth. And then one day he didn't show up, and at the end of the week, his VP came by, and he asked me how everything was going. And I said, "Well, I think it's going okay." And he said, "Yeah, I got to tell you about your driver." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "He was fired." I said, "Oh, that's too bad." He said, "Yeah, he was shorting stores their product and selling it out of the back of the truck." And so I just wanted to know, did you know that? How much did you lose and this sinking feeling came into me like, oh no, I don't know, And he said, look, I'm going to give you free 10 cases. Let's keep the relationship going. And we did, but it was, you don't think of an institution like Coca-Cola, would do something like that, but it's the individual. And it doesn't matter where we're working. Another instance, which was kind of more sad from my perspective, was the second store I had, I hired a young kid named Timmy. He was a high school kid. He looked like an all-American, blonde, football player type, student, athlete. And I needed coverage in the evening, like from 5 to 9 p.m. That's all I needed. And so I said, can you work a couple nights a week? He said, sure, I'd love to do that, Mr. O'Donnell. And, if I get done stocking the shelves, or if it's slow, do you mind if I study? And I said, oh no, Timmy, that's fine. Bring a book, and if things slow down, you can study. So Timmy started working for me. And after a couple of weeks, I noticed that after Timmy's shift, that we had a lot of payouts for the lottery. You see, the way the lottery works is if you have a winning ticket, you can go to any store that has a lottery machine and you can redeem that ticket. The store has to pay you out. And most payouts are like $5, $10, maybe $50. The big payouts, you have to go to the headquarters. But anyway, every night he worked, there was like 80, 100, $150 being paid out. And I started to get suspicious. So I asked him, I said, gee, what's going on with this? He said, well, people bring these tickets in. It's all deducted from the machine. So I said, all right, fine. I believe you. I'm not at risk. And then one day this guy shows up in the morning when I'm working, and he says, are you Mark? And I said, yeah. And he said, I'm Timmy's dad. I said, oh yeah. Completely naive, right? And he said, yeah, Timmy was arrested last night for grand larceny. And he said, I don't think he stole anything from you, but what he was doing is he used to work at another store down the road a bit, and he didn't get along with the guy and they had a fight, and he kept the key, and at night he'd go in and he would print out lottery tickets without paying for them. And then when he worked for you, he would cash them in for whatever he could get. And I'm like, oh man. I said, so how many did he print out? He said about $30,000. Whoa. So I went by that other store because I knew the guy, Bob, who owned it, who had mortgaged his house to buy it, poor guy. And he knew Timmy and his family. And I said, Bob, I'm so sorry. He said, yeah, I know the family well. I don't know what to do. I'm not going to press charges, but the lottery is, because they want their money. And so he's going to be in trouble with that. But, Mark, it's only money. There's a lot more to life than money. And I was really impressed. I mean, here's a guy who really suffered, right? I mean, most people would be infuriated. Maybe they'd shoot him. Who knows? But the thing that struck me was that this topic of truthfulness just plays out everywhere, whether it's the New York Stock Exchange, the convenience store, the big real estate deals that, we fancy we're doing. It's everywhere. And when it's not lived, the consequences are disastrous.
Timmy is now governor of some state somewhere, or mayor of
Yeah,
some
he
city
probably
somewhere.
is.
So if, as Guardini proposes, as you're just suggesting here, that the truth is the basis for everything, again, that's kind of a real hinge virtue, is this something we as the faithful can perfect? Is it like any other virtue that must become a habit?
Yes, I definitely think so. I mean, I think one of the best ways to become a truthful person is to go to confession frequently. I would say, at least once a month. It may not seem like a big deal, but it really is. Because we're constantly trying to align our lives with the truth when we do that. And then we're able to align environments where we work with the truth because we're more truthful persons. So people will come back at me and say, yeah, but I don't really want to go to confession because I just say the same things all the time. Blah, blah, blah. I'd rather just tell God my sins, privately. But I think we're missing the point there, because God wants us to petition him for help. And he also wants us to contribute to our own healing. So I think what we need to do is avoid occasions to sin ourselves as best as we can. And then, when we fall into sin, we go to confession and then ask God to heal us interiorly. And with that, I think that's how we grow in virtue. That's how we become truthful. And that's how we become joyful. That's how you become a saint. So I would think just that simple exercise of that sacrament is a great way to acquire this virtue. And don't underestimate the power of it. Every time we go to confession, we become a little more truthful. And in the Gospels, our Lord, when he talks about prayer, he's always talking about, being persistent, right? Whether it's, the widow who wants the godless judge to do her justice. And he finally says, fine, I'll do it for you. You've been bothering me. Or the guy who needs the bread from his friend, right? In the middle of the night, knocks on the door over and over and over again. Finally, the guy just gets up and gives it to him. Or the Syrophoenician woman who's bothering Jesus. That's one of my favorites, passages in scripture. When she just goes ask and ask, and the disciples say, send her away. She's annoying. And then Jesus tries to send her away. Basically, he says, look, I was only sent to the children of Israel. I wasn't sent to, to people like you. And then she kept insisting. And finally, when she has that great line about how even the dogs eat from the crumbs that fall from their master's table, Jesus turns and says, oh, woman, great is your faith. Let it be done to you as you wish. And so he wants us to kind of push.
Also, today, the day we're recording today's gospel, these two guys taking their buddy and talk about persistence and lowering them down through a roof.
Exactly.
To be healed.
So, we're if we apply that same persistence that we apply to getting in shape, running marathons, being successful, getting into the best schools, I think people can do that. I think they just need to see the value of it and the benefit of it. And they will over time if they persevere at it.
A theme for this entire podcast and kind of the genesis of it was focusing on this idea of evangelization, particularly the new evangelization. And in previous episodes, we focused on different ways to evangelize, mostly in our professional environments. And I'm just thinking, as we're speaking and as I read through that chapter, isn't being known as a person who tells the truth one of our more effective tools of evangelization?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. We want to be careful because people will consider us as naive if we're always truthful. So you want to protect yourself, protect your downside, so to speak. But I think it's the first way that we evangelize. We should be known as being trustworthy, honest, reliable, as well as competent. Otherwise, no one's going to want to work with us, since most work relationships are based on mutual trust. And we've all worked with people who are otherwise, and the long-term consequences just haven't been exactly stellar. And the two other examples I give in the white paper about my boss who wants a bonus he hasn't earned, or the client that wants research they haven't paid for, that you're gonna take your hits. You may lose your job, you may have your job threatened. We're not always going to come out on top, and I think a great example of this is the father of St. Josemaria. His name was Jose Escriva. Apparently he had this chocolate business in Spain, right, in the early 20th century, like around 1910, 1915. And he had a deal where maybe he bought it from a partner. In any event, there was, some sleights of hand and dishonesty there. And the business ended up collapsing. I think it had to do something with the non-compete agreement, where his partner may have said, I won't compete with you if you buy this, and then went out and did it. In any event, he had to pay off this mortgage by himself, and that meant he had to sell his house. He had to move to a small town. He had to get another job in retail, working at Home Depot or someplace like that. Then he lives in an apartment with his family, and his family's used to having servants. And St. Josemaria is talking about all this, right? And he even says that when this happened, he was so upset at his father, he didn't want to talk to him anymore. And for like a couple of weeks or a period of time, he just didn't speak to him at all. He had no respect for that. But later on, fast forward 50 years, St. Josemaria says, I'm glad my father's business failed because it taught me what poverty was. I never would have known it otherwise, you know. And I think that God used that event to shape St. Josemaria's soul so that he could eventually found Opus Dei and do the great things that he did. And so, you know, you think, Barbastro, Spain is the middle of nowhere, right? 1915. Who's going to see this? You're Jose Escriva. You're like, and his relatives are saying, well, just, don't pay it off and blah, blah, blah. Take care of yourself. And yet he does the honest thing, right? And now 110 years later, you and I are talking about it. Opus Dei is this reality, right? This podcast is happening because this guy, he manned up. He did it. Anyway, I think that's a great story.
That's good. I think it's a good one, a good story to end it on. And so I want to thank you again, Mark, for your comments and insights. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening. We will attach to the show notes just the title of the book. You can get it, in however you normally get books, but it is by Romano Guardini, and the title of the book is Learning the Virtues That Lead You to God. So with that, thank you again, and we will speak to you on the next episode.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for listening to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to be notified every time Peter and Mark release a new episode. And visit us on the web at onthemark.show.